I want to thank this award and, given the name of the prize, I found it pertinent to make a talk about Milton Friedman's academic contribution. From my point of view, Milton Friedman has had a fundamental role to regain the way to the ideas of freedom. In fact, the ideas of freedom, until entering the decade of the 20th of the previous century, were the dominant ideas, and, in fact, the dominant school at that time was the Austrian School. But some mistakes, especially what the Great Depression implied, led to thinking wrongly that the ideas of freedom were not correct. And the success of Keynesianism sank the world into a cone of darkness, which could end in the early 1970s. And that was due to the contributions of Milton Friedman, as the Keynesian device knocked down. From my point of view, and it is what I am going to try to tell in this talk, it is basically that Milton Friedman's academic work is a mirror work of the work, in reality, of the general theory of occupation, interest and money, of Keynes. Because Keynes's work is much more extensive, but in general the reference is usually to general theory, which is probably one of Keynes's worst works, from the point of view of economic analysis. Which does not mean that Keynes was a brilliant mind. What happens is that he worked for the bad guys. It was part of evil and then developed an analytical device based on the evils to put it in some way. So, the first point is, what was the world prior to general theory? Moreover, world in which Keynes himself participated in the debate, with what was the Cambridge School, England, with authors such as Robertson or Pigot, who discussed within a certain analytical framework and discussed, with the Austrian School, with Mises, with Hayek, or discussed with the Swedish School. In that sense, the first thing we should understand is how the previous analytical scheme worked, which was the entire Wickselian framework. Basically, the Wickselian framework was an intertemporal economy. It was a reinvestment scheme, where the interest rate was determined in the goods market and in the money market the price level was determined. That is, it was a model of an intertemporal nature because, precisely, savings is not more or less than future consumption. So why does savings upload when the interest rate raises? Because basically the interest rate is the relative price of the goods present with respect to future goods. Therefore, if the present prices rise, so that relative price is uploading, the interest rate is rising, the counterpart of that is that the present consumption falls and increases future consumption. And that is what makes us see that savings increase. On the other hand, if future prices were winning at the present prices and the interest rate will fall, a company should pass production to the future. Therefore, the investment increases. That is why there is a negative relationship between interest and investment rate and a positive relationship between savings and interest rate because it is basically a model of intertemporal characteristics. On the other hand, the purchasing power of money was determined in the goods market, so that when the money supply increases, the purchasing power of money falls. That is to say that all prices expressed in monetary units rise. This analytical framework had methodological defects, but it is conceptually clear. The idea of determining the goods market, the real interest rate or Wickselian interest rate, and thinking about the interest rate as an intertemporal coordination mechanism and not that aberration to determine in the money market, which is what Keynes did. But apart from that, you have the problem that was called the invalid dichotomy, and that arose that the functions of excess demand in the market of goods were homogeneous zero grade and the homogeneous quantitative theory grade 1, and, therefore, that generated problems. A problem that was solved by Mises incorporating money in the utility function and deriving the demand for money under the format of another good. Then, when one has an excess. So, if you have a central bank lowering the artificially interest rate, that generates excess demand in the goods market. The counterpart is an excessive supply in the money market, and therefore the purchasing power of money falls, and that is why it is what generates the rise in prices, and if you systematically do this generate inflation. Or they can generate cycles of boom and busts. It stimulates the activity, and then when that is artificially generated via the emission of money is not genuine, and then, when they want to materialize, the future consumption does not succeed, and consequently there is a collapse of the system that also is apart from the contribution of Mises. But beyond this, it was the mechanism, how this works, what I want to focus. Because Keynes, he came from mathematics and was a great mathematician, and then understood the analytical structure. Then, what Keynes did was destroy this analytical framework, creating a functional mathematical structure to messianic, corrupt and thieves politicians. That is, he wrote a work for those criminals called politicians, the caste, exactly. So, in that sense, notice that the first thing that Keynes does is break the temporality in the goods market. He breaks the intertemporal character of the goods market. And the first thing he does is build a consumption function that only depends on admission. And it generates this monstrosity called marginal propensity to consume, and the multiplier appears, which is basically, look at what delusional, because the multiplier implies a violation of the budget restriction. Because it is the idea of the multiplication of breads. That is, suppose that you have an economy that consumes 80 and invests 20. It means that the multiplier would tell you that 5 times the investment gives you the GDP. So what do they say? Well, let's upload the investment by issuing money, so we spend the investment from 20 to 40, so the GDP, instead of being 100, is 200. It is magical. It's just about being printing tickets. One thing really delusional. I know a country that did that for more than 100 years. It is called Argentina. If one of the richest countries in the world became a mid-table country, he destroyed 5 monetary signs, had 2 hyperinflations, but hey, something good had to be after such a disaster. It was obvious that they were not normal pressure and temperature conditions, and a libertarian, liberal president appeared. Therefore, what does is that now consumption is not an intertemporal function and savings becomes a residue. Therefore, it takes relation to the interest rate with savings, and consumption only depends on income. At the same time, then destroy the idea of investment depending on the interest rate. While one of the chapters on the investment is brilliant, in the other it says, well, all that does not depend. I use in Argentina a fairly rude expression that is invests for a lyrical theotic issue, if they are sung. Therefore, now the investment ceases to have a functional relationship with the interest rate and becomes an exogenous thing, the famous animal spirits. Notice that now savings and investment do not determine the interest rate, but now savings and investment determine income. And from determining income, they determine the demand for work, which in the other system did not make much sense, because all those functions of excess demand, where savings and investment came from, was included in the labor market. So what implies? From there the demand for work is derived, which depends on how aggregate demand is fluctuating. And given the offer, the nominal salary is determined. So, we have a goods market that now does not determine the real interest rate, but determines the income level. And, on the other hand, the labor market is created, where the nominal salary is determined. Now, the problem is that now we have two things to determine. We need to determine the price level and we need to determine the interest rate. So, one of the things that Keynes does, I say okay then, I have to determine the interest rate, and what it does is determine the interest rate in the money market, which is an aberration, because the interest rate has to do with an intertemporal coordination mechanism of how to pass consumption and production of the present to the future and vice versa. That is, the interest rate exists because there is time. So there Keynes puts the interest rate in the money market. Then, we went from a model where the interest rate in the goods market and the purchasing power of money was determined, that is, the inverse of the price level in the money market, and now we have that the income is determined in the goods market, the money market is determined in the nominal and clear interest rate, the model lacks as determining prices. Then, it creates the labor market as a function, a linear combination of what the goods market is and there determines the nominal salary and ends up destroying all the theory of value, saying that prices are a brands on costs, which in this case would be the salary. That is, it destroys all the subjective theory of the value created by Menger, William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras to return to the past, with which the theory of value is destroyed, and in that way it creates a tool. And although it is wonderful for politicians because you can spend and to the extent that you increase aggregate demand, as you are not in full employment, the system makes them have a first stage where the product grows, a stage where the product grows and the price level grows, and a stage where there is directly no effect in quantities and all that price. That is basically what Keynes does, and it is a mechanism by which public intervention justifies, but what has the underlying that is also a violation of the budget restriction, which is the multiplier. That is why it is tremendous that you go to Parliament, yes, go to the Chamber of Deputies and tell you about the Keynesian multiplier. It is an intellectual offense because it is something that violates budget restrictions. But well, they are things that happen between the world of politics and the academy. So, what we have is that Keynes destroys the entire analytical framework. This is not less, because there is an article that I love, which is wonderful, but it has an error. It is an article by Axel Lejonjevifeud, which is called The Wicksell Connection, and basically what Wicksell says is that the Keynes of the money treaty and is the general theory, and that there is in the middle, there is a Z-theory, and says that, in reality, from the treaty on money, if one adds the preference for liquidity and adds the adjustment by quantity, it reaches the adjustment by quantity. General theory. How wonderful the article is to accommodate the debate. That is incorrect because the analytical framework of the Keynes of the Treatise of Money is totally different from that of Keynes of the general theory. And then in Harvard Hansen appears and gives rise to what is known as literature treated the ISLM model, which was a model that determines, in the goods market, income and determines, in the money market, the nominal interest rate, and that an interpretation is made that, although Hicks in Keynes and the Classics makes the proposal of the aggregate supply and demand model, the offer block was not correctly specified or completely, to put it in some way. Then, the entire debate overturned in a debate between what is called the Keynesian cross, which is a situation where the investment is absolutely insensitive to the interest rate and there is preference for liquidity, therefore, they have a flat LM and a vertical is, or the classical world, which is the other cross, where the demand for money is a fraction of income and, therefore, there is no role for monetary policy, and the LM is vertical, while the investment is absolutely sensitive to the interest rate, and therefore the flat island. That is basically the discussion between the extreme Keynesian model and the discussion between the classic model, where in the extreme Keynesian model the fiscal and absolutely useless policy is the monetary policy. And in the classic case, the fiscal policy is tremendously harmful because it causes a crowding out effect, because the expansion of public spending generates rises in the interest rate, which has as its counterpart a fall in private investment. Therefore, the degree of productivity of private investment is usually substantially higher than the public. It would be better to leave things in private hands. While, in terms of monetary policy, this is perfectly effective, but the problem is that this is later manifested in an increase in prices. So, there was a whole discussion about elasticities and there is all the discussion of the Pigot effect, so that, what Pigot does is try to refute the argument of Keynes that only depended on consumption, income and that also depended on the real balances and that then you could boost the demand injecting money. And so was the debate. He was absolutely bogged down until a man named Milton Friedman was coming and began to break what Keynes did in the general theory, or if you want to repair the damage that Keynes committed. So what is Milton Friedman's first great contribution? And that it is, in fact, it is one of the considering for which they give him the Nobel Prize in economics. It is a book called A Theory About the Function of Consumption, where it develops the hypothesis of permanent income, where, when the income rises permanently, consumption automatically accompanies the increase in income. Therefore, marginal propensity tends to be 1, and when you have a transitory increase, as that will be distributed throughout an entire intertemporal situation, then it increases savings and does not have an instant or full translation over the income level. Therefore, the first thing that does there is to return the intertemporality to the consumption function, and when the intertemporality to the consumption function returns, the interest rate in the determination of consumption again and therefore in the savings has an important role. So now what had to break? Well, now what I had to return was to demonstrate that the investment was sensitive to the interest rate. On the other hand, counteracting this idea that monetary policy was not effective, that he had left the idea of the liquidity trap, and what Keynesians worked to prove that monetary policy was not effective. It was, for example, that example you can take to the horse to the lake to what? But if it does not drink water, it does not drink water, they cannot force it to drink water. Then, he says, there is a limit for the interest rate, which is zero, and therefore they cannot go further, and then they cannot force the horse to drink water. So, which later, when it was the 2008 crisis, you came to see cases of negative interest rates, but that is part of another discussion. Then Milton Friedman with Anna Jacobson Schwartz writes a book called The United States, Monetary History, and in Chapter 7, which is the Great Contraction of 29 to 33, two things basically demonstrates. First, that the monetary policy is not that it was not effective, it was tremendously effective, because precisely the Great Depression occurs due to a mismanagement of the central bank, that is, of the Federal Reserve. And there it shows that, in the face of a bank panic, what happens is that people scare. They left the banks, which had a fractional change system and were going to demand money. That also generated a fall in the demand for goods and, therefore, generated a deflation situation. Then, appealing to the Fisher effect, automatically the debts, in terms of income, flew and the companies went bankrupt. And at the same time, as banks take silver in the short and lend, and they find a deposit run, they have liquidity problems, then they stop giving credits. This explains how that action of the Federal Reserve in front of a run, in a fractional lace system, is what truly generated the disaster. And that when he corrected monetary policy, the world, the United States, came out. Therefore, what Keynes demonstrates that the hypothesis of the liquidity trap was only a methodological trap, a mathematical trap, to just generate this idea that monetary policy is not effective and justify the fiscal policy. At the same time, as the permanent income hypothesis takes strength, that, in addition, is then perfected by Mudd in the paper of 74. You make expansive fiscal policy and agents discourage future taxes, therefore, the fiscal policy is still effect. But not only that, but also shows, he says, investments are not taken according to the nominal interest rate, they are taken according to the real interest rate. And when you take the real interest rate flew, therefore, that collapse in the investment was well. So basically, what Friedman does is return the temporality to the consumption function and, therefore, to the savings function. It returns the value of intertemporality, that is, the weight of the interest rate explaining the investment. And, in addition, it also demonstrates that monetary policy is effective. But I did not reach that, because I was still dealing with the problem of liquidity trap, the relationship between the amount of money and the price level. Then, Milton Friedman does work on quantitative theory and demonstrates that the demand for money is a stable function, and being a stable function, when you increase the amount of money, you have a pricing correlate. Hence, Friedman acuña that famous phrase that says, inflation is always and in every place a monetary phenomenon. I usually complement it with a phrase that says, generated by an excessive supply of money, either because it rose the supply or because the demand fell, or the two things happened at the same time, and that translates into a loss of the purchasing power of money, which implies that all prices expressed in monetary units rise. Therefore, in these works that I am mentioning, whether the consumption function, monetary history and quantitative theory work, recomposes savings investment, determining interest rate, the effectiveness of monetary policy, and that in the money market is basically determined the price level. Now, what happens? Milton Friedman did not live on Mars, lived on planet Earth with beasts that argued in term 10. Then, he does a wonderful Milton Friedman work called Milton Friedman's Monetary Framework. And in that context, what does it do? Friedman is putting all these elements in the construction of what we, in the literature, if you want Modigliani or if you want Battiti, say, they called the classic model, and that confronts it against the Keynesian model. Then, he tells the Keynesians, the whole first part in a phrase is synthesized. You Keynesians have no way to determine the price level in the ISLM. Therefore, Keynesian's model Ford T are much more precarious than Keynes himself. I believe that Hicks himself killing himself from seeing all that. In fact, when they gave the Nobel 71 with Arrow, one of the things that Hicks says, they are giving me the Nobel for a contribution that I do not feel so proud, for the article Keynes and the Classics, where ISLM develops. ISLM also is Hanson's terminology, because he called him ISLL. As you will see, I have a picky issue with articles and others. As you will see, I am a quite rare president because I am talking about economic theory. So, what the world tells you by accelerating the inflation rate, then the Keynesians say, you cannot explain this because you have no way to determine the price level. That is, all the logic of that first part of the book is that you cannot explain this because you have no way to determine the price level, because you are determining the nominal interest rate in the money market and are determining the income into the goods market, and therefore they cannot determine anything. Then, there appears a man named Phillips and finds a relationship between the rate of percentage variation of nominal wages with respect to the level of unemployment. Find a negative relationship. From that, Richard Lipsey, depending on his hypothesis, who had been working on the labor market, and depending on that Keynes himself had said that prices were determined as a sea that absorbs costs, that is, Lipsey did read it to Keynes, then that makes prices a linear combination of wages, and, consequently, you can find a relationship between the rate of price variation unemployment. And that contribution is accompanied by an empirical estimate of Samuelson and Solow, where they test the Phillips curve, and from there they begin to make recommendations. Well, then, if I want to have a lower unemployment rate, I have to endure this level of inflation. And the world was there with those things. Obviously, that Mr. Milton Friedman with that was quite angry, not to say hot, for a few years. Theme that he solves it in 1968, in parallel to Edmund Phelps, which, by the way, sent me a dedicated book, Edmund Phelps, dedicated to President Milei, for eradicating inflation in Argentina. And in that context, Friedman writes the most read economy article in history, which is the role of monetary policy. And that is where the Phillips curve develops, increased by inflation. It is interesting because later, if you read the second edition of the book Price Theory, he dedicates a chapter to the Phillips curve. And this is very important. This would tell you that, beyond closing the debate on the Phillips curve, the most important thing is that it returns to microfundamentation. How does it do to tear down the Phillips-Milton Friedman curve? This is the important thing. It returns to the classic basis, that is, it goes and puts with the labor market. Then, in the labor market you have a job supply and demand, which depends on the real salary. But what happens? The expectations in the Friedman model are adaptive. It has to do with what happened with prices before. So what happens? If the monetary policy changes the central bank today, expectations are formed with old prices. So what happens? Monetary policy changes the central bank, inject money, so people start spending more. So the businessmen, who are seeing that their business prospects are improving, therefore, they see real wages falling. And, therefore, what do? They go out to hire more money. On the other hand, the workers, who are looking with past expectations, with the old monetary policy, believe that their real wages are rising. So, temporarily, everyone makes transactions out of balance and, temporarily, the level of economic activity increases. Therefore, when you give a thread to monetary policy, then the inflation rate goes down. Because expectations are adaptive. Now, when the agents see that they were wrong to expectations, they return back, and then the unemployment rate remains at the natural level. And you go to a higher inflation level, where Phelps's contribution is the hypothesis. He says that if you want to keep the unemployment rate low below the natural one, it has to be all the time accelerating the inflation rate. This is how everyone ended with a lot of inflation. And in that context, the debate ends because the Keynesians end up overcoming in the last shelter they had. And the one who ends up finishing all this is, in 1972, Robert Lucas Jr., in a paper of the Journal of Economic Theory, where, using the Muth hypothesis of the rational expectations applied to the macroeconomy, he ends up demonstrating that the Phillips curve is vertical. But, while Friedman's approach had a short-term trace-off and there was no long trace-off, in the case of Robert Lucas, if individuals knew monetary policy, automatically corrected, and then there was no trace-off or even short-term. And the only thing the politician could do, given, say, monetary policy, was to make a regime change, deceive the agents temporarily, get an effect, but then dilute. And what I said is that, since this volatility has an impact on the ability to respond, as you put more volatility, the offer is increasingly responding. And this Robert Lucas Jr. finishes closing it in 73, when it makes the empirical validation of the Phillips curve under rational expectations. That also generates a debate about rules and discretion, where rules policy is clearly better. And in fact, in that he had also made a Friedman contribution, putting himself on the side of the rules. Then, from my point of view, Friedman's work, on the academic level, we have the recovery of intertemporality in consumption, in savings, the recovery of the investment function, the power of monetary policy, the monetary nature of inflation, the value of the rules, and the return to microfundaments. And this return to microfundaments and intertemporality makes Robert Lucas Jr. say, to see what are we discussing? Because the truth is that we spend almost 30 years arguing stupidities, or almost 40 years arguing stupidities, 37 years. So what are we doing? Then, with the return to microfundaments and intertemporality, Robert Lucas Jr. wonders, well, let's see. Let's stop the ball, and what do we want to talk about when we talk about economics? So what did he do? He returned to the fountains, returned to Adam Smith. While there are 3 Adam Smith books, one that has articles that were left there, which were compiled after dead Adam Smith. It has the theory of moral feelings, and he has research on the nature and cause of the wealth of nations, better known as the richness of nations, for friends. So, in that context, says what wanted to explain Adam Smith. Economic growth, and then it begins to explore economic growth. So what happens? He meets the Solow model and the empirical problems that the Solow model had, which only explained 15% of growth and, therefore, everything else was residue. Obviously, Robert Lucas Jr. was not going to take too much for Herod's models and tame, obviously. Then, in that context he begins to explore other cases such as what we had said arrow with the theme of learning by doing. There was a problem because the models did not converge, had certain problems and all that discussion. Then it was and revalued back Ramsey's model, but Ramsey's model fixed the dynamic efficiency problem, but could not generate long-term sustained growth once the steady state arrived. So, it was a growth model that did not explain growth, and that all the growth was given outside, so it was like a problem. And then, there in the 80s, a mathematician decides to go to study at the University of Chicago, and his thesis guardian is Robert Lucas Jr., Mr. Paul Rober, then Nobel Prize in Economics, is the one who develops the models of endogenous growth. And from there, Lucas popularizes that idea of endogenous growth in the readings of Lionel Robbins of the year 85, and from there, all the new macroeconomics of the intertemporal format appears, with all the models of endogenous growth, and that culminates in the theory of real cycles, which was a deeply interesting theory. You will say, and what do you have of the theory of real cycles? And look, I am going to give some applications. The first is that when I arrived we were on the edge of a hyperinflation, and the only way we had to cut inflation was cutting the growth of the amount of money, and for that we had to make a fiscal adjustment and a sanitation of the balance of the central bank. We had a consolidated deficit of 15 points of the GDP, 5 in the treasury and 10 in the central bank. And we decided to undertake the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity, with an adjustment of 15 points of the GDP that took place within 6 months, and the wholesale inflation that came to the monthly 54, which implies 17,000 annual. The last available data was 1.2%. That is to say that we lowered inflation from 17,000 to 15 annual. So as you will see, I believe in the monetary nature of inflation, but on the other hand, and more in my Austrian spirit, yes. Because since 2014 I became a devotee quasi-fundamentalist fanatic of the Austrian School. About that I not only fell in love with Mises, of Hayek, but that I fell in love Rothbard and made myself anarchist. Therefore, I am anarcho-capitalista, with which I also despise the state, and I am inside the state to break everything, to shrink it. In fact, I have a ministry that is the ministry of deregulation. We made a structural reform that is 8 times larger than that made by Menem and had been the greatest in history. We made 800 structural reforms. Every day my deregulation minister, a brilliant economist and excellent human being such as Federico Sturzenegger, every day he dysregulates something. I will tell you a very funny anecdote. He was at a bilateral gathering of the G20 with Modi of India. Then I say, no, well, I have it here to my Minister of Happiness. Because it is. My Minister of Economy shots things, is that of the chainsaw. I love my Minister of Economy. In addition, the best Minister of Economy in the world, a crack Toto Caputo, was chosen. And on the other hand I have Sturzenegger that also gives me a lot of happiness when it deregulates. Then, in general, one sees between 1 and 5 deregulations per day, and that day I said 4. I believe that for education Federico told me nothing because I think that if I had marked the error it would have been tremendous because I had not drawn 4 regulations, I had taken 44. I think that either he jumped and gave him a hug of fanatic goal, or, alternatively, I would have put me to dance above the table. He removed 44 regulations that hit prices, a wonderful thing. I could not have resisted it. The meeting would have been dynamited. It seems that I was exaggerating, but those who know me really know that, in front of a shock of those characteristics, I can get very euphoric. Or I would have finished the meeting quickly and I would have gone to celebrate with Sturzenegger so much productivity. Therefore, this is also unique in the history of modern democracies. Next year we have an election year and we enter the year with the zero deficit commitment. That, if there is growth and it is permanent, we lower taxes. And, in addition, zero emission. That is, without fiscal policy and without active monetary policy. Tell me if that is not to believe real business cycles. And finally, on the 10th, the day I made the speech, I was lucky to talk to a very prestigious Argentine economist named Juan Pablo Nicolini, who works in the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis. He told me about a job he did that determined how much the Argentine economy can grow from the budgetary balance. We have balance in the financial line. We pay the operational expense and pay the interest. In that sense, the work only looks at the impact on the growth rate of the GDP per capita of the fiscal balance, and only with the Argentine fiscal balance is ensured, according to a work by Robert Lucas Jr., a growth of 4.5% per year. In about 10 years, Argentina will make your GDP grow at least 50%. And, as we talked to Dr. Nicolini, that's a floor. That is an apartment because we reach fiscal balance by shrinking the state. To the extent that we have economic growth, we are going to lower taxes. We will remove the state from the middle and we will give people more freedom. That will also generate more growth. In fact, the structural reform we made allowed us to jump about 70 positions in terms of economic freedom, to be among the worst and most unpresentable in the world. Today we are in the middle squad. And I still have 3,200 structural reforms in my pocket. Therefore, I am going to make Argentina, in addition, the freest country in the world. Something that, when Ireland did it for 30 years, made it the richest country in the world. Not richer, but it has a 50% GDP per capita than that of the United States. But not only that, but also, if you contemplate all the structural reforms that we are putting, surely Argentina will grow much more than that 4.5%. And that will make, if we continue clinging to the ideas of freedom and defending those ideas, we will make Argentina big again. We are going to make Argentina again as a power, and we will be a testimony for everyone that what really works are the ideas of freedom. Long live freedom, damn it.